One day it's the draft, and then the next, all of a sudden, it's free agency. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back for the second half of the whirlwind that is this week in the NHL calendar. Especially when you cover a team that doesn't make the playoffs, you've got the end of the season, then very little to nothing happens for that team specifically anyway over the course of the playoffs. Then suddenly, draft, free agency, and we're into the offseason where you've got another month and a half to 2 months with very little to nothing happening. With that said, though, I suppose for anybody that was at all concerned about the free agency part of the calendar not being that interesting from a Kraken perspective, well, as it turns out, this free agency was a very interesting one, or at least the first day of it was anyway, as the Kraken make two pretty big moves as Ron Francis signs the two richest contracts that he's ever signed in free agency on the same day. Actually, for that matter, never mind free agency, they are by total value of contract, the two richest contracts that he's ever signed, period. And the Kraken came right out of the gate swinging on free agency day 2, as they almost immediately signed, thanks to permission to negotiate with the player ahead of time, defending Stanley Cup champion and 30-year-old right-shot defenseman Brandon Montour to a 7-year deal that will earn him just over $7 million per year. And then not long after that, they had another 7-year contract to another 30-year-old player, this time staying more in line with the draft class that they just picked up a couple days previous, with a left-shotted center in Chandler Stevenson, formerly of the Vegas Golden Knights, who will be earning just over $6 million per year at 6.25 per season. But before we dive too deeply into those contracts, which we will be getting to, let's talk about what these two players, Montour and Stephenson, add to the Kraken on the ice. Starting with Montour, the first of the two signings for the Kraken, at 6 foot tall and just around 200 pounds, the, again, right shot defenseman, was originally drafted 55th overall in the second round of the 2014 entry draft by the Anaheim Ducks, and has now at this point spent at least part of 8 different seasons in the NHL for a mixture of Anaheim, Buffalo, and obviously most recently the Florida Panthers, where he just got finished winning the Stanley Cup. And in that time, he's put up some pretty decent offensive numbers, with the offensive part of his game definitely being more of the focus, with 252 points on 66 goals and 186 assists over the 520 regular season games that he's played in that 8-year career. And the good news is that in spite of being 30 years old, and you'd have to think probably coming down out of his prime, still his best 3 seasons in that 8-year career are the last 3 in Florida, in each of which he put up at least 30 points, with the lowest being 33 in this last season, though that happened in 66 games, so still a half point per game, 8 goals and 25 assists there, and missing a large portion of the season at the beginning due to an off-season surgery, so he still played the majority of the season and the entire back half of it, as well as the full Stanley Cup run for the Panthers. But really, the highlight and the one that stands out on the sheet is clearly the season before, the 22-23 season, where he put up 73 points on 16 goals and 57 assists, both career highs in 80 games played, all of which got him not only some all-star recognition, but also got him some Norris votes at the end of the season, though he didn't really come that close to winning it. And of course, as you can also see, his advanced stats, or at least expected plus minus, as measured by Hockey Reference, also definitely like these last 3 seasons for him in Florida. Clearly, with less games played, didn't have quite the same amount of time to build up that stat in this last season, but still safely in the positives there. And while getting back to some counting stats, he might not have the block shots or hits that you would necessarily want from a defensively focused defenseman. Again, the offensive part of his game is certainly more of the focus, and he certainly spends a lot of time out on the ice, with over 21 minutes of ice time per game over the course of his entire career, and significantly more than that in these last 2 seasons, over 24 minutes 2 seasons ago, and then 23 and a half per game even coming off of that surgery and injury this last season. And on top of that ice time, a chunk of which comes on the power play, which we'll get to here in a second, I do think that it's worth mentioning that even with a slight step back offensively, or somewhat noticeable step back offensively from that incredible 22-23 campaign, he also did improve this last season defensively to at least make up for some of that gap. So even with potentially his offense starting to, go downhill a little bit as he goes further and further past 30, he still seems to be improving the other end of the ice, which could be a good thing with the age of this contract as it continues to go along. So all in all, I do really like this signing for the Kraken. I think Montour is a great fit for the team, at least over these next few seasons. The age of the contract we can talk about here in a second, But as far as making the team better in the now, this is certainly a good step towards doing that, and Montour immediately makes the blue line a lot better for the Kraken, which was already a strength of this team. Still, the part of this that is probably the best for the Kraken is his ability on the power play, where at least as far as some of the analytics community is concerned, the more time he spends on the power play, the better, and honestly, considering how the power play has gone for the last couple seasons, really the entire existence of the Kraken, that will probably continue to be true as long as he is in Seattle. It definitely adds a pretty good second power play quarterback to Vince Dunn on the first power play, and it might not even rule out the chance of the Kraken rolling 2 defense on the power play, putting both Dunn and Montour out there, especially with Montour's speed and ability to transition through the neutral zone, and maybe even get the puck into the offensive end, or help Dunn along the blue line with his incredible ability to traverse the blue line and find the passes or shots that other players might not be able to find and defenses might not be expecting, which definitely has shown up in his stats over the last couple seasons, where just around half of his points in the last 2 years, including that great 22-23 campaign that I've already mentioned a couple of times, have come on the power play, with the vast majority of those being assists. In fact, he had 30 assists on the power play alone in that 22-23 season. And on top of all of that, not only will having another good power play quarterback hopefully get the Kraken get things going on the power play this season, whether Montour plays on the first unit or second unit, or honestly probably a little bit of both over the course of the full season, it'll also help take a little bit of pressure off of Riker Evans in his first full season in the NHL, as coming into the free agency period before they signed Montour, it really did seem like that second unit was going to be Evans to run, sink, or swim. I mean, if things really went poorly, then maybe they throw one of the other defensemen out there, but there was pretty much Vince Dunn and Riker Evans that had really any kind of suiting towards playing a quarterback role on a power play. And then there's also the fact that, especially after what we saw happen last season towards the end of the year, it'll help the Kraken have a little bit of what we could call Vince Dunn insurance, where last season, when Vince was out of the lineup, the Kraken were pretty much helpless generating offense. The offense took a huge hit, and the Kraken record also took a pretty huge hit. One of those 2 big 8-game losing streaks happened not too long after Dunn went down with one of those injuries at the end of the season that ended up basically sidelining him for almost the entire last third of the year. So to have another player that has an offensive focus that can help the Kraken get down the ice, especially through a breakout and transitioning through the neutral zone, will definitely happen just in case there is another injury to their top defenseman. Now, of course, this does all come with the caveat or potential downside of, well, the contract, which isn't necessarily terrible, but it also isn't fantastic. It's actually not a terrible deal here for the next 2, 3, maybe even 4 seasons of it, especially if he's able to get anywhere near back to where he played 2 seasons ago in that full season, and hopefully he is able to play full seasons or close to with the Kraken and can avoid any further injuries. But even with all that being said, and even in the best case scenario, there's really no way around the fact that a 7-year contract for a 30-year-old, even if it is a defenseman, is a contract that's not likely to age terribly well in the last 2 or 3 seasons of the contract. Now, with that being said, there are ways to get out of the last couple of years of a bad contract, which we can get a little bit more into after we talk about the other player the Kraken signed, since, well, it's going to be relevant with that contract as well. Either way, for the time being, assuming he stays for the full contract, which I think is a pretty big assumption to make, the last couple of years could be a bit tough, which is also around the time that you would think the Kraken are trying to look at opening a potential window to make some deep playoff runs and even go for a Stanley Cup, assuming that the farm system and some of their young drafted talent is at that point in their prime and getting them ready to make those runs. But we can talk a little bit more about the contract after we talk about Stephenson and his contract. As far as what this means for the Kraken decor, it does mean that they're going into the season with 7 NHL defensemen, or I guess 6, and Riker Evans coming up to fill another spot. And that does mean that Evans might have to fight for a spot here in training camp. I think the natural look of things would be that Dumoulin would be the extra defenseman, or then again, maybe not, as the Kraken, while I was editing this video, decided to go and trade Brian Dumoulin to the Anaheim Ducks for a 2026 4th round pick, which not only helps free up this situation on the defensive end where they had 7 NHL ready defensemen, 6 veteran defensemen, and then of course Riker Evans coming up. And that means they probably end up filling that 7th spot with a Cale Fleury, or maybe they bring up a couple of guys like a Gustav Olofsson has also played with the team, but could also look at potentially Vilja Tavainen or one of the other prospects and give them some time. Either way, it also frees up over $3 million of cap space that was going to Dumoulin, and that certainly will help with the signing of both Tolvanen and Beniers, and maybe gives them a little bit of space to pick up another depth forward or something like that. We'll just have to wait and see, but it is a move that does make a lot of sense as far as where things stood after the Montour signing. Oh, and yes, this does also mean that Justin Schultz will not be returning to the Kraken. He hit free agency at the same time as all these other players, and especially with Montour signed, not that Schultz was likely to come back when the Kraken didn't re-sign him before free agency, but yeah, there's just not a spot for him anymore, just in case you hadn't really been following along or paying attention since the season ended, which is fair. Anyway, with that, let's move on to the other signing of the day. In similarly sized, 6 foot, around 200-pound, left-shotted center Chandler Stevenson, formerly of the Vegas Golden Knights, who is 11 days younger than Montour, but also a 30-year-old player, this time drafted 77th overall in the 3rd round by the Washington Capitals of the 2012 entry draft. Since then, he's played in at least part of 9 different NHL seasons, really making his NHL debut, though, in the 17-18 season with the Capitals, where they'd go all the way to win the Stanley Cup over the Golden Knights that he'd eventually play for. That cup, by the way, he won with both Andrei Burakovsky and Philip Grubauer, so some familiar faces on the team. Anyway, in those 9 seasons between DC and Vegas, where obviously he'd also end up winning a second cup, he has put up 207 points on 89 goals and 181 assists over just under 500 NHL games, 495. So then with stats like those, and you can definitely see it in his 3 most recent seasons where he has 43, 49, and then 35 assists, he is much more of a distributor of the puck rather than a shooter himself, something that we've gotten used to seeing in the middle 6 for the Kraken at the center role in Alex Wennberg. And even Vegas, you might hear some frustrations with Stephenson and that they would wish he had shot the puck a little bit more. Either way, if you can put a winger that will actually shoot the puck along with him, he might be able to create some plays that allow that to happen. He's not necessarily as much of an offensive driver or as good in transition as Wennberg was, but he still is a pretty good forward and has some good offensive ability. He's definitely a fast skater, which, like Montour, definitely adds to a quicker style of game that the Kraken are looking to play, especially under the Bielsma system. And hopefully that will mean that he has a bit of a bounce back season, as this last one was not a fantastic year for him. 51 points in 75 games, but just not a year that went terribly well. And depending on who you ask, a lot of that success is just due to being on the same line as Mark Stone. And even in some cases, some of the analytic community will point to Stone having played worse while Stephenson was out on the ice. In fact, Stephenson, by analytics, was in some ways the worst forward that the Vegas Golden Knights had all of last season. And that does kind of show up with the expected plus-minus, where this last season, the negative 3.4 is the first time he had been negative in quite a few years, and the first time in Vegas. Even with all that having been said, though, he does offer a couple of things on the forward end offensively that the Kraken could desperately use, or certainly could have used last season, one of which being his shooting percentage. Now again, he's not necessarily the easiest forward to convince to shoot the puck regularly, or at least hasn't been to this point in his career, and it's hard to expect that to change at the age of 30, but when he does shoot the puck, he has a pretty high shooting percentage, a career shooting percentage of 15.5, and is consistently well above what the typical NHL average is. Somewhere around 10 is usually what you expect. So he may not always shoot the puck, but at least when he does, he seems to be pretty good at it, or at least has more frequent success than most players do. And just because I brought up the reference of Alex Wennberg as another center in the middle 6 that the Kraken have had that also didn't shoot the puck as much as you'd like him to, Wennberg has more of that typical 10% shooting percentage that you come to expect, so at least with Stephenson, when he does shoot the puck, he's gonna score more often. And of course, as us Kraken fans know all too well, he's also pretty good at shooting with his feet, as we saw in the first game ever in Kraken history. But even more so than that shooting percentage, especially given again how much he actually shoots the puck, what the Kraken could really use that he provides in the offensive end, or even defensive end, or really anywhere on the ice, a few specific spots on the ice, is his ability to win faceoffs, as he, unlike just about any center the Kraken have ever had, or really any player the Kraken have ever had, aside from Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, who was good at winning faceoffs, but really was only a role player on the 4th line and spent a good chunk of the season injured, Stephenson is also good at winning faceoffs, a career faceoff win percentage over 52%, and had an especially good season 2 years ago where he won 58% of his faceoffs, and even last season was still again above that 52%. And I think, as we all well know at this point, after 3 seasons of the Kraken struggling to win faceoffs at more than a 45% rate, that's something the Kraken could desperately use, to have a face-off specialist that can also play pretty well significant minutes each night. Though with that being said, he did not have a particularly great season defensively. In fact, it was a pretty terrible season defensively this last season. Really, that's the part of his season that drug the entire thing down and made it look as bad as it was. As far as some of the advanced stats, he was a bottom 10% of the league defensive forward last season, and that makes it harder to want to put him out there for the defensive zone faceoffs, and those, at least from Kraken experience, can be some of the most consequential ones. So all in all then, he's at least a decent offensive forward that can help move the puck down the ice with good speed and distribute it in the offensive end. He'll probably play a role on the power play, especially when it comes to winning the opening faceoff at the power play, so the Kraken actually start some power plays in the offensive end. That'll definitely help things out. And with Montour on the blue line, that would also help the Kraken on the power play. That, I'm sure, was part of the thought process into both of these signings. And as we just talked about, he does offer the Kraken a couple of things that they could have desperately used more of last season, especially when it comes to the ability to win faceoffs more than half the time, heck, even more than 45% of the time, which has been right around where the Kraken have been as a team over each of their first 3 seasons. And if he is able to bounce back from what was easily his worst season in Vegas last year, then that certainly will make him a valuable addition to the Kraken on the forward end, and hopefully not a liability back the other way defensively. Though honestly, the Kraken, who were one of the best teams defensively last season and one of the worst offensively, it might not hurt to have a player who's a little bit more focused on the offensive part of the game. Still, the clear elephant in the room is that contract. At 7 years, $6.25 billion, the contract is, well, there's just no way around it. It's a terrible looking contract. Even if he does get back to the best that he's played over a full season in his career, then he's maybe just barely worth this kind of money. I think you could make an argument if he does bounce all the way back to that, then it might not be a terrible contract for 2 or 3 more seasons. But even at that, it's still a contract that's going to age horribly into the 4th, 5th, certainly 6th and 7th years of it. Especially given what we know about how he played last season, this contract really does look like not only an overpay for what he is right now, but also a lot of term on top of that. And then there's how he fits into the Kraken roster, or maybe doesn't really fit in a natural way. With Alex Wemberg having been traded out at the deadline, I thought part of the reason for them doing that was to free up that C2 spot, the second center spot, for the promotion of Shane Wright this next season. Now, obviously, that is assuming that Wright is ready for the full-time jump to the NHL, and we've already seen that Matty Beniers as the full first-time center has drawn a lot of attention that maybe made the sophomore season a bit harder for him, and it's been possibly part of that drop in production. Hopefully, not so much that it hurts his confidence going forward or stunts his growth at the NHL level, but there's always the possibility that with Beniers trying to work through that, making Shane Wright go through the same thing as a C2 center might not be the best possible course of action. But even still, at the same time, the situation is what it is. Both of them are going to need to learn how to play at the NHL level, and at the moment, they're the 2 best centers that the Kraken have. And adding another top 6 quality center in Stephenson, especially with Gord already pretty much locked into the 3rd line role, it really does muddy the water as to where Beniers and Wright fit in. You'd have to think that Beniers is probably going to get either 1st or 2nd line center duties, with Stephenson probably getting the other line, and then Wright is playing, I guess, center of a 4th line that's just going to get a lot more minutes than your typical 4th line. And maybe in that way, it helps the Kraken go back to more of what they found success with in the 2nd season of running 4 pretty equal looking lines. And who knows, maybe it's worth taking the gamble that adding a little bit of extra competition for those top 2 center spots helps push along the development at the NHL level of Wright and Beniers through that competition, and they can get better maybe quicker than they would have if they have to actually earn those roles rather than just having them handed to them, which is kind of where we were going into this season. Still, it is a bit of a gamble, and to do it with a 7-year contract and a guy that, at least as things stand right now, is going to be a part of this team well into where both Beniers and Wright should be in their primes, and having fully claimed the top two center roles, regardless of which one is filling which role, at which point you've got Stephenson as a $6 million third liner, I guess, and not a particularly good defensive third liner. And that brings us to the other part of this contract that I don't necessarily like, and that is that especially with Gord being in the last year of his contract, it really makes it look like this could be the last season of Yanni Gord in Seattle. And look, that's part of sports. You can't keep players around forever, but between the two, at least right now, having not seen Stephenson ever play for the Kraken, so who knows how things look after this season, and knowing that Gord did not have a great offensive year this last year, I'd still rather have Yanni Gord, and especially with the leadership that he provides for the Kraken in the locker room. Never mind the fact that the Kraken are paying him $1 million less and could potentially get him for even less than that after this season, especially with him being 32. And maybe there's a bit of an aspect of how much longer does Gord want to play, but still, it's a bit of a tough situation to figure out how this plays out in the long term. I suppose there's also the possibility that one of these guys ends up moving out to the wing, whether that's Beniers, Wright. I think Beniers' game probably lends a little bit more towards being on the wing, but he is more of a center. Stephenson, obviously a bit of a more of a natural center, though he has played some on the wing over the course of his career. And with him being 30 years old, as he gets farther and farther from his prime, maybe you do move him to the wing to take a little bit of that responsibility out. And you can always throw whoever you want in the faceoff circle. It doesn't necessarily have to be the center, so you could still have him on the wing of whoever and then have him take the faceoffs, especially if you have a center who's not particularly good in the faceoff circle. So in the end, with the Stephenson signing, while there are reasons that it does make some sense and he adds some things that the Kraken could use, to me there's just a lot more reasons this doesn't make any sense, especially with the contract that it comes with. Even with that being said, as I've said a number of times, it's just more fun to be an optimistic fan, so let's assume that things go well. Stephenson bounces back, Montour plays up to how he's played the last couple of seasons, maybe even gets back to how he played a couple seasons ago. Things go well over the next 2, 3, maybe even 4 years, and these contracts don't look bad. Still, there's really no way I see around these contracts aging poorly into years 5 and certainly 6 and 7. Now, the good news there is there are plenty of ways to get around that, as I said earlier. For one, the salary cap is likely to go up quite a bit in the next 7 years, so the contracts won't look nearly as bad in 7 years' time as they do right now, where they take up 8 and 7% of the cap. That's going to go down quite a bit over the next few years. So while the money the Kraken are paying them isn't going to go down over the next 7 years, the amount of the cap that it takes up certainly will. There's also the possibility then that one or maybe even both of these contracts end in LTIR. Now, this is not something you'd like to see happen because it does mean that they would have to get injured for it to happen, the long-term injured reserve. But it is a possibility that especially once you get closer to 37 and playing a game as rough as hockey, there's always that chance. It is something that we've seen happen fairly commonly over the last few years across the NHL, especially with these bigger, longer-term contracts. Players not playing the last few years of them, and those contracts just sitting on LTIR, sometimes even getting traded between teams for different cap relief reasons. Now, when it comes to the salary cap and the whole LTIR situation, that is pretty hard to predict what that's going to look like in 7 years' time, because in a couple of years we've got the CBA, which is very likely to shake all of that up, especially LTIR, with the widespread discontent of how that whole system has worked here and the number of teams that have taken advantage of it to go into the playoffs with team salaries that are well above the salary cap, even to the hundreds of millions. Heck, the Lightning won with something like 18 million over the cap, and then the Golden Knights won with a similar amount over the cap. So I would have to think that that is likely to change at least in a couple years' time, and we just don't know what that is going to look like come 7 years down the road. Now, assuming the best case scenario that the players do stay healthy and we get to the last couple of years of the contract that don't look very good, and there's still the part of the Kraken organization, there is the very likely situation that one or both of these contracts could end up getting bought out by the Kraken, and then you have to deal with the salary cap hit of the buyout, which we've seen the Wild. I mean, those were bigger contracts that they dealt with Suter and Parise, but a similar situation where the Kraken could have a penalty against the cap for buying out a couple of decently sized contracts out for the last couple seasons of them. And finally, there is what is probably to me the most likely situation with both of these contracts come those last couple seasons, and that is that the Kraken end up trading those players with the attachment of a draft pick or a prospect to move the contract to a team that isn't trying to compete at that time, which again is another thing that we see teams do all the time, whether it's at the trade deadline or in the off seasons, to give some incentive for a team who's not trying to compete, maybe like a Calgary Flames, for example, who seem like they're headed into more of a rebuild type of situation. They might not be great in a few years' time, so you attach a draft pick or two, or maybe a prospect to that bad contract and send it to that team, which as far as the Kraken are concerned, well, at the moment, with everything going as well as it has been in their farm system, they could very well have a plethora of prospects that they just can't bring all of them up to the NHL, and maybe you send one of those prospects with a bad contract that you don't want the last 3 or 4 years of off to somewhere else, and it doesn't hurt you over the last few years of it. But anyway, all of that is the problem of future Kraken teams. As far as the Kraken team this season and going into this next season, where they would very much like to get back into the playoffs, both of these signings I do think help the Kraken get there. They certainly help on the ice regardless of what the monetary value of the contracts are. There is still the issue that they have to figure out how to fit both a Beniers contract and a Tolvanen contract into the remaining cap space, which I think is between 8 and 10 million. Actually, now that I think about it, with the Beniers contract, and I promise this will be the last part of the long-term implications of these signings that we'll talk about before closing things up here, but Beniers is very likely to sign a 2 or 3 year bridge contract here. Probably not a huge AAV, but it is still going to be halfway through these contracts the Kraken just signed when that bridge deal comes to an end, at which point Beniers will be signing his big contract. Now, whether things don't go great and that contract is between 5 and 6 million over the long term, or if things go the way we'd all like it to and it's more like an 8 to 10, maybe even 11 million contract that Beniers signs, it's going to be very hard for the Kraken to fit some of those middle six guys that they currently have in the lineup into the cap with the contracts they just signed, and Beniers, as well as Shane Wright, who is going to start his ELC this season, and he'll have to sign a contract in 3 years' time. Now, maybe he signs a bridge deal too. That goes 2 or 3 more years. These contracts will still be on the books when a potential Shane Wright bridge deal is getting done as well. So yeah, just doesn't make a ton of sense, especially again the Stephenson one, to have that much money locked up on the forward end for a guy that, when your star players or potential star players are going to be hitting their prime, is still costing you $6 million for a 37-year player. Anyway, as far as the team right now is concerned, these signings do make the team better. They certainly make them better offensively, which was the goal after how last season went. The Kraken, one of the worst teams when it comes to goals for per game. They were very good defensively, and while neither one of these necessarily make the Kraken that much better defensively, I don't know that that makes them a lot worse defensively. So as far as right now is concerned, the signings will help the Kraken be a better team, especially the Montour one, I think really will help the Kraken over the course of at least the next 3, maybe 4 seasons. And the Stephenson, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe he does bounce back with a change of scenery. Maybe things in Vegas, it was just time for that to end. And again, on the optimistic end, which I said before, both of these players are good skaters, quick up and down the ice, which does fit the type of system the Kraken are looking to play under Bielema this next season. He, with the Firebirds, was very much a quick-paced game, getting down to the offensive end as fast as possible in transition and playing that transition game. The rush game that the Kraken also did pretty well in the season where they were good offensively. So adding a couple more good skaters to the team certainly helps play into that play style, and maybe that helps, say, Stephenson bounce back and Montour get back to where he was a season ago before the injury. And I suppose finally, to be fair with these contracts, well, the term doesn't look great. There were a lot of contracts that were getting this kind of term over the course of this first day of free agency, especially a lot of the big name players were getting at least 6 to 7 years. So it's not like Ron Francis was the only GM out there signing long-term contracts. It just seems with the salary cap finally taking the first big jump that it has in a while, or one of the first big jumps it has since COVID, This was just the market that was out there. If the Kraken wanted to make big additions, they were going to have to sign some big term and figure it out down the road. There also is a little bit of a smell or sense that I get from these contracts that Francis might feel a little bit of a warm seat under his butt, that if this season doesn't go very well, it could be his last in Seattle. So you take a couple of big swings. If they work out, great. The Kraken make the playoffs, you keep your job, and you can figure out the long-term part of the contract later. And if things don't go well, then he probably isn't in Seattle anymore, and the contracts and what they mean for the team long-term aren't his problem. As always, though, I'd love to know what you think down in the comment section below about each of these signings, not only what they mean for the team in the short term, but what you think of the contracts as far as the long term and potential long-term implications. And real quick, before we close things out, a few other things that have come up here over the last few days. The Kraken sound like they're about to start filling out the assistant coaching staff. We also saw the exodus of some Kraken players via free agency. Cole Lind, who the Kraken picked up in the expansion draft, is headed to Dallas. A couple of more notable ones. Wemberg, who the Kraken already traded away, but he's headed to San Jose via free agency. And of course, Chris Drieger is going right back to Florida, where the Kraken got him from expansion before he played the first season, had that injury in the offseason, and well, obviously we know the rest. He took the Firebirds to the brink of, once again, almost winning the AHL title with the Calder Cup. Which, as far as that's concerned, also one of the more important players in that playoff run in John Hayden signed an actual one-way deal with the Kraken, so he'll have a chance, it sounds like, to actually earn a spot on the Kraken roster out of camp this season. So best of luck to Hayden. With that, though, I think it is time that we brought this one to an end. As always, if you made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy the video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, go Kraken.